The evidence we have of calendars are things called parapegmata, or if you're talking about just one, a parapegma, which are calendars that are dug up every so often from the ancient world. They're essentially blocks with holes in, and the idea is you move a wooden peg from one hole to the next on each successive day. Now, alongside these holes, you'll also have helpful hints, like, for instance, today the winds will blow from the south, or quite often that today is the day that Ornis rises, or today is the day that Arcturus sets, and things like that. Now, what we find is that Delphinus keeps appearing in all these parapegmata. Its morning rising marks certain events, its evening setting marks certain events, its evening rising marks events, and so on. And this is really weird, because if you look at Delphinus, it's a small constellation, and none of the stars in it are particularly bright. The brightest is below magnitude 3, which is fairly faint as stars go. They're so obscure that they weren't really even named until fairly modern times. So what's happening? And I think what's happening here is that Delphinus isn't a particularly bright constellation. You know, the stars are certainly bright in it, but it actually has a very unusual position in the sky. The morning rising more or less coincides with the winter solstice. So if you want to know when the day of the solstice is, it's actually quite a good idea to have a look out for Delphinus. At the same time, just like you can see it just rising before the morning, the sunrise, if you look at the night sky, when the sun sets, it'll become dark enough to see the stars, and you'll just see Delphinus before it slips below the horizon. And this happens around the same time. And that's very useful if you're observing in winter, because in winter, obviously, the weather isn't always going to be very good. So it gives you a couple of chances of observing the same an event on the same day. And I think that's what's happening here with Delphinus. Otherwise, you'd expect them to use a brighter star that's in more or less the same part of the sky. Altair, for instance, would be a very good marker for the start of December. So we definitely see that the Greeks are using this constellation to calibrate their local calendars. So finally, is there an interesting Apollo Delphinios beyond Delphi? Well, you find Apollo Delphinios right across ancient Greece. You find it in Athens, you find it in Massalia, which is now modern-day Marseille in France, Miletus in what we would call Turkey these days, all sorts of places. And on top of that, not only do we have evidence of cults of Apollo Delphinios, but apart from Athens, these cities actually have months named Delphinios after a festival to Apollo Delphinios. Now, it'd be great if we could actually say when these festivals occurred. Unfortunately, all we know about Thera is that it had a month called Delphinios. We don't know when it was. We have another inscription from Aegina, and we know that it's not in a sailing month, which would suggest it's a winter month, but again, it doesn't tell us exactly when Delphinios occurred. However, when we look at Olus, we find that there's a month Delphinios, which happens more or less after the rising of Delphinus in the sky. And if we go to Athens, we find that there's a festival, a sacrifice to Apollo Delphinios on the 7th day of the month, and this is the month that immediately follows the rising of Delphinus. So that would suggest that we have all four things we need. We can see that the Greeks did recognise heliacal rising. We can't be certain that the constellation existed in the 8th century BC, but we can certainly push it back at least to the 5th century. We can show that they were using this constellation bizarrely for all sorts of calendars right across the Mediterranean, and there's definitely an interest in Apollo Delphinios. So it looks like it's quite reasonable to say that Delphinus could mark the time when you should go and consult Apollo Delphinios.